Tonight we're here to celebrate a fabulous new exhibition, the Great American Hall of Wonders. In a nutshell, it tells us how Americans came to believe that we have a special genius for innovation. This story is told upstairs in the exhibition through some of this country's most beautiful and hallowed treasures, great icons of art, science, and invention that have been lent to us by some of the most generous lenders in the country. We have Charles Willson Peale's great self-portrait showing off his wonderful museum. We have the golden spike that united the two railroads, the Transcontinental Railroad. We have Audubon's handwritten field journal showing him in the process of finding the great birds of America. So it's a rich show. It's very dense. I hope you'll get a chance to see it again and again. The show is on through the end of the year, and we would love to have you come back and bring your friends. I especially want to thank the lenders. They were extremely gracious. I can't thank them enough for parting with these treasures. And I want to acknowledge the splendid collaboration of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. We are happy to have David Kapos, the head of the office, and his able number two, Richard Maudsley, here, who have been great collaborators with us through many, many months. Of course, we're in their ancestral home here, so it's a natural affinity that we have. I also want to especially acknowledge the super leadership support we got from Battelle. Battelle is a global company. They are involved in innovation every day. They are making all of our lives better. They have been extremely gracious. We have their CEO, Jeffrey Wadsworth, is here. You want to raise your hand, Jeffrey? He's somewhere here. Over here, there he is, down in the front. And we are very, very happy to partner with a company so integrally involved with the ideas of this exhibition. I also want to thank the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, my old stomping grounds. They too are totally committed to fostering innovation across America. And we have many generous members on our Board of Commissioners who have also contributed to this show. Claire Perry is going to tell us, so I don't need to explain, that America started with an act of imagination, and I have to say this exhibition did too. Claire came several years ago with this brilliant idea, a sort of imaginative concept for how she could encapsulate this broad cultural study. She is perhaps uniquely suited to do this kind of cultural study, taking on a broad topic across decades of American history and cultural experience in many spheres of life. This is her expertise. She is a PhD art historian from Stanford. She also has an international economics degree from Georgetown University School of International Studies and has a foreign, help me Claire, foreign service, thank you. She's written a book that is a true page turner. It's a really fun read, and I encourage you to also acquire the book and read it. Finally, I really do believe that the Smithsonian is the perfect place for this show. It is an institution that is deeply committed to art, science, and invention. It carries forward the great innovative ideas that have animated this country from the beginning. Our show draws on many of the units and museums of the Smithsonian, and we are really excited to have Claire here to tell us all about it. Claire, thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and Betsy, I really appreciate you calling my book a page turner. If people want to buy it and thumb through the pictures, I'd be really happy. So no reading of the text is required. Let's get started. The United States began with an act of imagination. The founding fathers envisioned our country as a great experiment for promoting human happiness, an ongoing test of democracy that would be sustained by the inquiring spirit of each new generation. When the last of the founders died in the early decades of the 19th century, a new generation of citizens took up the work of the experiment. It was a time of transition and social upheaval, and the new generation was terrified that they might fail. but they were energized by their shared belief in American ingenuity and by the idea that the people of the United States were natural-born problem solvers. 19th century Americans felt a strong and personal sense of responsibility for the nation's destiny. They believed they needed a wide range of knowledge to be ready for the obligations and opportunities of democracy. Everyday people read books about botany and the great republics of ancient history, and they crowded into public lectures to learn about the weather and geology. In home workshops, they tinkered with springs and levers to make devices that made work easier and more efficient, and they honed their skills in art to create inspiring visions of the nation's forward-thinking people and its sublime landscapes. Charles Willson Peale was one of the most energetic and inventive members of America's revolutionary generation. He was a saddle maker, an artist, naturalist, mechanical inventor, a taxidermist extraordinaire, and the founder of a famous museum in Philadelphia. In 1822, when Peale reached the venerable age of 81, the trustees of his museum asked him to paint a full-length self-portrait to honor his great contributions to science, art, and mechanical improvements in the United States. Peale took advantage of the commission to sum up his life's purpose and to set forth a template of the work of citizenship in the United States. The artist titled his painting, "The Artist in His Museum," and in it he showed himself as a guide ready to embark on a tour of the galleries. Behind him stretches the long room, a 100-foot space filled with collections brought in from all parts of the United States, the vast laboratory where the nation's experiment in democratic government was underway. Peale's museum held more than 10,000 objects, stuffed birds, shells, fossils, paintings, mineral collection, insects, and mechanical marvels. Peale devoted a lot of space, as you can see, on the left side of his painting for his bird collection because he was so proud of it. The artist was a great shot, and he collected many of the birds himself, but they also came from science-minded people around the country, like his friend George Washington, who sent a pair of pheasants. When he worked as a saddle maker, Peale learned to stretch skins with overwood forms, and he used that skill to shape dead birds into lifelike attitudes. The dead turkey at his feet is awaiting his reanimating art. Above the bird compartments, you can see a long row of portraits framed in gold. These were revolutionary heroes: Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all the usual suspects. The pictures represent the apex of the scientific pecking order that governed the long room. But Peale was not really completely satisfied with these small pictures of the nation's founders. He was very happy about his successes with arsenic and other innovative preservation techniques, and he toyed with the idea of exhibiting a small group of select embalmed founding fathers. But he finally abandoned the idea because he was concerned about the possibility of distorting their facial features, and he decided to paint their many portraits instead. Taxidermy isn't the only meaning of the turkey at Peale's feet. Beneath it is a taxidermist box, a reference to the mechanical tinkering that occupied Peale throughout his life. He experimented with prosthetic hands, copying machines, telescopic rifle sights, smokeless stoves, and he devoted his space in his galleries to teaching his visitors about the mechanical arts and that each of them could develop the skills to be an inventor of useful labor-saving devices. Peale keeps partially hidden in his painting the most famous attraction of his museum, which was the mastodon skeleton that Peale had uncovered in a great dig he organized to search for the evidence of the immense ancient animal that Thomas Jefferson had called the great carnivorous elephant of the North. However, Congress had denied Peale the subsidies he requested for his National Museum, So he is resigned to be a man of business. He won't show us the full mastodon until we've paid the 50 cents to enter the long room. But the artist in his museum aims to transcend the scientific observations that organize the museum. The grand 8 by 6 foot painting itself, it's almost this size, maybe just a little smaller. It's the extravagant sweep of the red velvet drape in the painting that signals that a program of art is beginning. Yes, it's curtains for the revolutionary generation. Jefferson, Adams, and Peale himself would be dead before the end of the decade. But the curtain sets the stage for the nation's second act. It tells citizens that an act of imagination would be required of them. The United States at the time was anything but united, and Americans feared that the country would not survive the loss of its founders. Peale's painting insisted that it was not the revolutionary generation, but invention itself that lay at the heart of the national project. Straddling a space between artistic and scientific vision, the old saddle maker opens his hand to welcome us and passes on the stewardship of his great American Hall of Wonders to the experimenters of the future. Peale's painting addressed a nation that stood on a threshold of a new way of looking at time. When the Declaration of Independence claimed Americans' right to pursue happiness and the freedom to define how and when they would pursue it, what I call democratic time dawned over the land. Democratic time represented the value of the minutes, days, and weeks of individuals empowered by democracy, expanding social mobility, and economic opportunity. Americans became people in a hurry, and foreign visitors remarked on their quest to do more, faster. A French economist who came in the 1830s described the United States as a country where one lives 100-fold more than elsewhere. Here, all is circulation, motion, and boiling agitation. Experiment follows experiment. Enterprise follows enterprise. Not surprisingly, clocks were big business in the United States, and here we see Eli Terry's mass-produced box clock, famous because so many Americans had one. In the early years of the 19th century, Eli Terry and other Connecticut clockmakers worked out factory machinery to create standardized clock parts that then were assembled into finished clocks, what came to be known and admired around the world as the American system of manufacturing. Before Terry, clocks were made by skilled artisans who took a lot of time to make just one clock and who charged a lot for it. So clocks were things reserved for the wealthy. The American system allowed lots of clocks to be made quickly and cheaply, and by the 1840s, every American household had a clock, even the humblest cabin in the backwoods. Here's a painting of a timely subject by Lily Martin Spencer, a full-time artist, and God bless her, the mother of 13 children. We can surmise that Spencer knew a thing or two about efficient time management. She supported her large brood with income from the sale of her paintings while her husband moved through a series of not very successful jobs and projects. This work is titled Listening to Father's Watch, and it gives us some clues about how democratic time worked differently for different members of the national community. In the 19th century, respectable women did not have careers, so Spencer's household was highly unconventional, but her paintings showed home scenes where women did the cooking and the sweeping up while men rested from the labors of enterprise. The picture here shows a bearded man holding a gold watch up to the ear of a delighted child. The handsome paterfamilias is enjoying a relaxing interlude, and his rich dressing gown hints at the end of the workday. Mother's work is never done, of course, and 19th century women were charged with the moral, physical, and intellectual well-being of their children and extended families. Duties included serving regular hot meals and maintaining attractive, wholesome home environments. The home management expert Catherine Beecher warned her countrywomen of the divine wrath that awaited those who neglected their duties. She said, "A woman is under the obligation to arrange the hours and pursuits of her family so as to promote systematic and habitual industry, and if she refrains from promoting regular industry in others, she is accountable to God for all the waste of time consequent on her negligence." Of course, Beecher herself was also rebelling against some of the social conventions that limited women's choices about how they would use their time. Among other things, Beecher rejected the idea that women were unsuited for science. She didn't make the leap that females should become professional scientists, but she encouraged women to undertake their domestic duties with scientific precision. This is a picture from a book Beecher co-authored called The American Woman's Home, or Principles of Domestic Science. And what is it? Oh, is it a woman's laboratory? Yeah, it is. It's a kitchen. One of the few arenas of enterprise in 19th century America that were open to women and others on the margins of social power was the United States patent system. Patent application forms usually didn't require that you list your gender or your country of origin or your race. So busy mothers, free blacks, and recently arrived immigrants found that they could slip under the barriers of what was usually considered possible or fitting in the United States. The Patent Office building in Washington, D.C., exactly where we sit tonight, was constructed on a plot that was originally intended for a great cathedral or a pantheon of American heroes. Instead, this wonderful building built here was a secular place of honor, a temple of invention, they called it, and it showcased the creative talents of average citizens. The Patent Office required inventors to prove through drawings and small models that their inventions were new and useful. And by the 1850s, more than 100,000 people came each year to see the designs that filled every shelf of every cabinet in every gallery in this building. Observers lingered reverently before the models of Whitney's cotton gin, McCormick's Reaper, Morse's telegraph, devices that had transformed American society and earned a lasting place for their makers in the annals of American heroes. But the overwhelming majority of the models and drawings on view were made by regular folk and represented only tiny improvements on existing technologies and practices. Visitors to the Patent Office left here with the conviction that anyone, anywhere, could be an inventor. When Americans visited the nation's scenic wonders, they seemed to slow down, to take time to enjoy the beauties of nature and to contemplate timeless things. Niagara Falls was the brightest jewel in the United States crown of natural beauties, and poets, painters, presidents, farmers, newlyweds, and anyone who could afford the cost of the trip made a pilgrimage there. The artist Alvin Fisher traveled to Niagara Falls during the summer of 1820, and his painting titled The Great Horseshoe Falls showed that a visit to the falls was not for sissies. The artist captured Niagara's torrents plunging into foaming whiteness under a threatening sky, and near the center of the canvas, a young woman covers, these technological devices, they don't Well, she's in the yellow there, and she's covering her ears to shut out Niagara's roar. And on the left, those guys on the left, that group of three who were looking like this, they're about to help a friend returning from the thrilling flight of wooden steps leaning down to the bank of the river. Everyone knew about these stairs from exciting first-hand stories published about them. Those who were fit enough to attempt the stairs raved about the fascinating geological formations they saw going down, and then went on and on about how rickety and slippery the stairs were, and how when you got to the bottom, you got dashed by water, and dramatic barometric shifts snatched your breath away. For Fisher and his contemporaries, Niagara embodied the limitless, untamable power of American nature. Many of the artists who painted Niagara were steeped in science, none more so than Frederick Church. When he went to Niagara, he drew from his frequent readings in a home library filled with science books as he created an exhaustive visual record of the water currents, botany, geology, and weather of Niagara. Church's name was famous across America at mid-century, and when word spread in 1856 that Church was at Niagara making detailed studies for an important painting, people nationwide waited with keen expectation. The artist unveiled his huge painting titled simply Niagara in 1857. He swept away most of the observations he had recorded in his sketches, paring out almost all but water from the scene and leaving just a sliver of land as a life raft for the eye. Church's painting cast the viewer on the waters an instant before the plunge into the watery abyss, a lover's leap that unmoors the sense of an individual self. The painting created a sensation in the United States. Audiences rushed to see it and swooned over its breathtaking realism. One famous reviewer stepped in front of its rainbow, thinking that the colors came from sunlight in the gallery. Americans said that the painting inspired an intense surge of patriotic feelings. As one reviewer put it, Church's Niagara was a true development of the American mind, the result of democracy, individuality, of the liberty allowed to all. Niagara was so big and its beauty so beloved by so many that its energy wasn't harnessed until the 1890s. Preservationists fought tirelessly to protect it, protesting that the falls was a national treasure that belonged to the whole country. But a power company had selected Niagara as the site of a huge hydroelectrical plant in the 1890s, something far, far bigger than ever had been attempted anywhere in the world. The scale of Niagara's flows meant that engineers had to entirely rethink earlier generations of turbines and also invent bigger generators, bigger transformers, and things that didn't even exist yet. One of the engineers at Niagara was Nikola Tesla, who declared that Niagara had enough power to light every light, heat every stove, power every factory, and run every single engine in the United States. And it was at that charged moment that the artist George Inness decided to create a series of paintings there. As he sat at his easel in 1893, the project was nearing completion, and workers swarmed over the site, and the noise of drills hammering on metal and steam engines filled the air. People around the country were waiting for Niagara's wonderful new dynamos to begin transmitting. Inness seemed to plug into the inventive energies swirling around Niagara that year. He released his painting from the emphasis on scientific accuracy that had guided portrayals of the falls for more than 100 years. In Inness's canvas, we make out the deluge of Niagara behind a sheet of aqueous colors and forms that sets our imaginations adrift. A red flag in the foreground and a smoking industrial chimney in the distance float like signal buoys in the artist's strange dreamscape, a nebulous vision of the United States at the threshold of illumination. Americans devised innovative technologies at Niagara that delivered power to tens of thousands of people in the region by the end of the century. But of course, other inventive citizens had been delivering much more power to many more Americans for much longer. These were the nation's gun makers. The United States was born with a gun in its hand, brought to life at Lexington when a colonial David pulled the trigger on the Goliath of the British Empire, what Ralph Waldo Emerson would describe years later as the shot heard round the world. Thanks in part to their success in the Revolutionary War, citizens came to believe that the people of the United States had a marksman's eye, a natural visual acuity that gave them special advantages in their business dealings and social exchanges. But it was not the Americans' expert marksmanship that won the War of Independence. It was the ability of the disparate communities of the colonies to create a shared vision and work together to realize it. And these were people who really hated each other. Townfolk, farmers, wealthy planters, people of Puritan stock, Quakers. Our revolution happened because they found a way to reach a consensus. During the 19th century, America's cantankerous people stood square in the crosshairs of the promotional campaigns of the nation's innovative firearm makers. Samuel Colt was probably the most famous in this group, and he invented a revolver that could fire 6 shots without reloading. To raise the money to start a factory for his new firearm, he traveled around the United States on the lecture circuit, and he assumed the persona of Dr. Colt, and he called himself a practical chemist from New York, London, and Calcutta. Dr. Colt's specialty was laughing gas, and by charging spectators 50 cents to watch his demonstrations of the discombobulating effects of nitrous oxide, he earned enough money to open his factory. Colt's revolvers became famous for their reliability, and the inventor gave a simple reason for buying his products. He said, "The good people of this world are very far from being satisfied with each other, and my arms are the best peacemakers." Gun promotions had a symbiotic relationship with a new genre of frontier art that was emerging in the 1840s. Easterners were curious about the frontiersmen who roamed the far reaches of the West, and everyone loved stories about Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and other mountain men. So they flocked to the popular art galleries that were suddenly filled with paintings of rough and ready, straight-shooting Western trappers and scouts. A frontiersman is in a fix here in William Ranney's painting of 1850, The Trapper's Last Shot. He's sitting on a horse that's up to its hocks in water, and its eye shows that it's afraid of something approaching in the tall grass, and we can see what that is over there on the left, some yahoo lifting up a rifle and heading this way. The work's title indicates that the trapper has one bullet left in his arsenal, and his aim with this last shot is all that stands between him and a violent death at the hands of the Indians who reside in the territory. This kind of image was everywhere by mid-century, and it tapped into fears very much on the American public's mind as Eastern settlers were moving into the homelands of Native people in the West. But the happy ending of a picture like this was always understood. The Civil War increased both the number and quality of guns produced in the United States. The North created a variety of firearm innovations during the war, including the telescopic rifle. The telescopic rifle took center stage in an image of a Union sharpshooter in Winslow Homer's picture. He created this image while working as an artist correspondent for Harper's Weekly, a magazine where he worked during the war. In the image he titled Army of the Potomac, a sharpshooter on picket duty, a soldier looks through the sight of a telescopic rifle as he searches for a target. Sharpshooters were called for duty when there was a lull in the action and weary soldiers were resting. Homer's image is reportorial and accurate, but it also betrays his revulsion for its subject. The shooter is splayed awkwardly in the tree like some kind of a malevolent monkey, and the humanity of his face is blotted out by the gun. The artist ignored the aura of glamour that surrounded the sharpshooters in the northern media and made Harper's readers become witnesses to a cold-blooded ambush, a summary execution without courage or honor. The late 19th century artist William Hartnett was famous for his hunting-themed still lifes. Americans loved his highly realistic pictures of rustic doors with rifles and powder horns and other hunting paraphernalia hanging from them. Hartnett gave a dark twist to his hunting theme when he replaced the rifle with a Colt pistol in a painting he titled The Faithful Colt. Hartnett's viewers understood the pistol as a weapon of interpersonal violence. The pistol was the weapon of dueling cowboys and rough-and-ready miners. Pistols were what ladies tucked in their purses before embarking on train journeys, and what desperados pointed at bank tellers. Hartnett gave little indication of the owner's identity, so a viewer can imagine all sorts of swashbuckling types hanging from its nail like a crooked question mark. The faithful Colt invites us to ponder where it has traveled and what wrongs it has righted. The painting's trompe-l'oeil technique, the fool-the-eye realism of a master artist, embodies the idea of the marksman's eye, the keenness of vision that 19th century people believed was a special American talent. At the same time, the image's painterly fooling also connects to the old showman, Dr. Colt's sham identity and the money he earned in the laughing gas trade to open his factory. Hartnett's painting allies illusionism and a pistol in the kind of alluring image that is deeply implicated in setting the stage for armed encounters between Americans throughout the 19th century. The faithfulness of Hartnett's title refers not only to the reliability of Colt's patented revolver technology, but also to the idea that the weapon was a dependable solution to conflicts, a peacemaker. But if the work of democracy is consensus building, the search for a common ground of understanding is an American's most important charge. By leaving the owner of the revolver out of the picture, the faithful Colt prompts the sharp-eyed viewer to ask the obvious question, faithful to whom? 19th century America was a land renowned for the number and size of its animals, and the most celebrated of its animals was the buffalo. Citizens took great pride in the teeming herds of bison that covered the prairie and saw them as a symbol of the country's overflowing nature and the dynamic energy of its people. At the same time, they wondered about the place of such wild creatures in their expanding nation. Charles Willson Peale, the Philadelphia Museum founder, advised the upcoming generations to safeguard the country's wildlife as a valuable resource. He also taught that studying the habits of animals was a way for democratic citizens to learn about the natural laws of wise governance that animals modeled. Over the course of the 19th century, millions of bison would lead the people of the United States in an extended course of instruction. The lesson of the buffalo was so monumental and profound that even today, we are still trying to comprehend its full meaning. Beginning in 1830, the artist-explorer George Catlin made 5 trips to the western frontier, inspired to go west by the idea that America's native people and its great herds of buffalo would soon melt away in the face of advancing civilization. He made numerous paintings of bison as part of his survey of Native American life, and most of them showed buffalo herds where there was exuberant fighting and wallowing in the mud and stampeding. But in one of his pictures titled Buffalo Bull, Grazing on the Prairie, Catlin singled out one animal to make a rather polite introduction to his Eastern audience. The buffalo switches its tail and pauses, curious to gaze back at us, a confident creature still accustomed to spending most of its time undisturbed by human beings. Artist Images verified Western explorers' reports of massive herds roaming in the immense expanse of the West. One Western traveler wrote about seeing a herd that stretched as far as the eye was permitted to rove. Another reported seeing bison fill the entire landscape, where he rode over 3 days. But reports about apparently limitless numbers of bison were matched by a parallel stream of commentary in scientific journals, political speeches, and in newspaper editorials that predicted the animal's imminent extinction. Influential people said the herds and native peoples who hunted them must be ready to step aside for progress. And progress seemed to mean industrial belting. Innovative tanning techniques made it possible for buffalo hides to be used for factory belts in the expanding industries of the East. And of course, the Civil War had led to the development of powerful new rifles and large numbers of men who were adept at using them. When the war was over, a lot of out-of-work soldiers headed to the plains to hunt for hides that would be shipped east for industrial belting. And during the hide boom of the early 1870s to the early 1880s, hide hunting was the second best paying job in the West. The first was prostitution. Many Americans protested the slaughter of the bison. They knew there was enough land in the West to set aside areas for the animals, and that the animals could be used productively to supply meat, tallow, and leather. But for all the Americans who were able to envision a way to coexist with the buffalo, there were more who could not. The artist Albert Bierstadt could not. Bierstadt's many wealthy patrons raved, and critics often groaned about his work's dramatic feats of imagination. But in one of the grandest American paintings of the 19th century, the artist portrayed the demise of the buffalo as something inevitable and necessary. In the distance, we see a desolate valley in the west, and the foreground is filled with dying bison and scattered skulls. In the middle, a lone buffalo and an Indian hunter struggle in mortal combat. Darwin's theories were igniting the salons, pulpits, and university lecterns of the United States at that time, and they also drove the artist's invention. The painting is an exposition of what contemporary Americans understood as survival of the fittest. It captures the moment when the less advanced stepped aside for the more advanced, presumably the people who are the audience for Bierstadt's painting. As the artist was putting the finishing touches on this picture, the nation was ablaze with the news that the last of the great buffalo herds had vanished. Hide hunters still wandered the plains, guessing that the buffalo had merely migrated north into Canada and would soon return. But the United States Army confirmed in the late 1880s that the herds that once had covered the prairie were no more. I think it's important, just generally, to look at the positive, but I'm not sure how to end this story about the bison on a positive note. What I can say is that the people of the United States were shocked, saddened, and ashamed when they learned that of the millions of bison around at the beginning of the century, there were only a few hundred left. They had busy lives, and maybe they weren't paying much attention to what was happening in the faraway territories of the country. And maybe they also believed the stories that had circulated since European explorers first arrived in this land, that America's nature was so prolific and bountiful that it could never be truly diminished. So let's step away from that sad picture to a happy picture. A new railroad looks like it's arrived someplace like the Rockies, and everyone in the small settlement on the left is pointing, and we can see them smiling and almost hear them cheering. The United States was huge and always growing. By 1850, when California joined the Union, it spanned the continent. How could such a land be governed Americans embraced the railroad as the solution to the nation's daunting spaciousness. One reporter said that the railroad would bind together with ribs of steel the whole of this great country. 19th century artists experimented quite a bit to portray trains and railroads' new forms in appropriate and aesthetic ways. America had contracted a raging railroad fever and wanted lots of pictures of railroading, but trains were noisy and messy and smelly, and they often exploded. So how to portray them in ways that were accurate and pleasing? In the mid-1850s, George Innes took a stab at it. A railroad company had commissioned him to paint its line and roundhouse in Pennsylvania. Innes edged the painting he titled The Lackawanna Valley with misty mountains, groves of trees, and other elements that were the stock and trade of professional landscapists. But what about those tree stumps in the foreground? And that train, well, it's hauling a load of coal, and that doesn't look really that picturesque either. And the roundhouse at the heart of the painting looks like a spaceship that's just come in from Tatooine. Although we may cringe at this frank image of the toll of railroading on the land, Innes probably intended his work as a confident endorsement of the railroad expressed in the terms of his day. His painting acknowledges the disorder of building a new technological system, but it's addressed to a nation of railroad lovers who have faith that the changes will bring much more than they take away. The landscape painter Jasper Cropsey took a different approach. In this work, titled Starikov Viaduct, Pennsylvania, he envisioned a railroad that tread lightly on the land. In the distance, we make out the grand row of blue stone arches of the Starikov Viaduct's 1,200-foot span, hailed by booster Americans as the eighth wonder of the world. This is a civilized place, looking like ancient Greece or Rome, not a wilderness. And yet, the artist has nestled the railroad within the beauty of a thriving woodland. Cropsey's panorama imagines something very important: the vital technological advance of an efficient transportation system that coexists with an intact natural landscape. Innes's and Cropsey's paintings had something to say about trees. And a lot of American paintings in the 19th century had things to say about trees, because America at that time was renowned for its trees. And the first European settlers to arrive encountered unbroken stands of trees that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. Where Europe's forests were rapidly being depleted, here there were enough trees for ship masts, roof beams, spinning wheels, church pews, and fine cabinets to be harvested over many generations to come. And maybe that's part of the reason why it just didn't make much of a stir when the giant sequoia were discovered in California. In 1850, gold rush adventurers came upon a forest of giant redwoods in the Sierra Nevada. They gazed in awe at trunks that were wider than steamships and great limbs towering 300 feet above them. The news of these forest wonders, as old as the pyramids and the Parthenon and taller than the tallest building on earth, soon spread from the mining camps to San Francisco and the rest of the country. A pair of enterprising fellows had the bright idea to strip the bark off of half of one of the biggest trees and lash it to a ship going round the Horn to New York. They sent it to be exhibited on Broadway in New York City. But it was the heyday of P.T. Barnum, and the great American pastime was sniffing out a humbug. The good people of New York looked the thing over, and most of them pronounced it a fake, just another gold rush tall tale. It wasn't until 1862, when the photographer Carlton Watkins displayed a group of his California photographs in New York, that Easterners decided that the big trees were real. Here at last, in a scientific medium produced by a machine that could not exaggerate or lie, was evidence that the great forest realms of California truly existed. Thanks in part to Watkins' pictures, the giant sequoia of Yosemite's Mariposa Grove became famous around the nation. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln turned away from the work of the Civil War to sign legislation that set aside the Mariposa Grove and the Yosemite Valley as a state preserve. However, there were many giant sequoia that were on private land, and the owners continued to log them, but I'm not exactly sure why. Big tree lumber wasn't really good for anything because it was brittle, and you couldn't use it to make houses or furniture or much else. So the people who logged the big trees usually just shipped the wood to farming areas to be used for grapevine stakes and trays for drying raisins. In the 1870s, our friend Albert Bierstadt made the long trip across the continent to California. Most everyone in the country knew Bierstadt's name, and he was famous for his portrayals of big things, big buffalo herds, big mountains, big western skies. Now he would paint the big trees. He began his excursion to the Mariposa Grove by making detailed sketches of the giant sequoia. Then he retreated to his studio in the east to attempt to create an image of the big trees that did justice to their size and magnificence, something that art critics said was impossible. He finally emerged with a canvas that shows a wondrous forest, but the image reveals only the bottom of the trees, as if the artist had conceded that even his considerable painterly talents were no match for the sublime verticality of the Mariposa Grove. The painting includes a group of Native Americans that points to a very different art of landscape. A female Indian carries an acorn gathering basket on her head and walks toward a pair of men sitting by a river. The band calls to mind the tilling, planting, and harvesting work through which tribes in California created an environment that nurtured hundreds of generations over millennia. When 19th century scientists counting the giant sequoia's thousands of concentric rings began to speak of the pyramids in the Parthenon, they might also have spoken of the enduring landscape art of the Indians who thrived in the region of the big trees. The whole of California was their great canvas, made up of carefully tended habitats that supported some of the highest density populations in North America and some of its most diverse societies. Bierstadt's vision of ancient trees and people begged the question of the newcomers who were its audience. What were they cultivating? For whom? And for how long? We're gonna finish up with a last landscape painting because I love these so. This is by the Ohio artist Robert Duncanson. He created this painting titled Landscape with Rainbow in 1859. And the picture shows a sunlit meadow in a broad valley where a barefoot girl and boy gaze at a rainbow that's appearing in the sky. The landscape is a place of beginnings with wildflowers blooming, a young generation coming up, and in the humble cabin on the right, a family that is starting a fresh and new territory. Throughout the 19th century, landscape painters in the United States had visualized the kinds of places where patrons and viewers said they wanted to live. The artist portrayed a realm poised between the wilderness and the crowded city, the middle landscape that America's founders, poets, and average citizens defined as the foundation for happiness, prosperity, and freedom. As an acclaimed African-American artist, Duncanson was a wonder in his day. Most Black Americans at the time were slaves on Southern plantations, and even freed Blacks in the North were confined to the most menial jobs as farmhands, porters, and chimney sweeps. Duncanson envisioned something different, Outfitted with his brush and tubes of paint, he explored the boundaries of what was considered possible in the United States. Among his many paintings, Landscape with Rainbow was an especially daring foray since it included a rainbow, something that 19th century artists considered one of the most difficult things to pull off convincingly. Furthermore, as Duncanson worked out his composition in 1857, audiences around the nation were swooning over the breathtaking rainbow in Frederick Church's Niagara, which art critics pronounced the last word on the subject. With his Landscape with Rainbow, Duncanson placed his own work alongside the highest accomplishment of an acclaimed master. And despite the quagmire of racism that surrounded it, contemporary critics hailed the painting as a resounding success. One reviewer called Landscape with Rainbow most expertly managed, and another said he could make almost any sacrifice to lay down by such a river. In 1861, when a Cincinnati newspaper praised Duncanson as the best landscape painter in the West, it recognized his status as an inventor, that most esteemed of American professions. Duncanson's creation had nothing to do with cams, levers, or patents, of course. Claiming his right to participate in the nation's most elevated endeavor, the intrepid artist had invented himself. We Americans are inventors. Our modern technologies have surpassed the 19th century's beginning efforts, and we know our forebears' failures well, from the decimation of the buffalo to the ruin of the Civil War. But we are the heirs of their successful experiments, as well as the ones that went terribly awry. And that is why we should look back. As we confront the complexities of the 21st century, knowing where we've come from may show us where we're headed. How do we sustain our nation's liberties, its bountiful natural systems, and its prosperity? If we accept the Founding Fathers' premise that the great experiment is refreshed each day by each American, we have work to do. This is the message that Charles Willson Peale hoped to impart to visitors at his galleries. His displays gave evidence of America's natural abundance, but his museum represented much more than a bonanza of resources awaiting development. With reverence, Peale laid out a project of stewardship and invited the people of the United States to devise a nation that would endure. His Hall of Wonders posed the question that first sparked the great experiment. Can you imagine? Thank you.